Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you to share our understanding with the iridology and also mast cell activation, how the amino acid histidine is important for the different phases of mast cell activation, whether we're dealing with cytokines, whether we're dealing with heparin, and also histamine. Vital Life Energy Formulas does not treat, diagnose, cure, profess a cure of any sort of disease. The latest newsletter that was sent out to everyone is showing you or explaining to you about mast cells. An excess histamine response leads to either heparin, cytokines, or a histamine response. The free-form amino acid histidine uptakes histamine in our blood vessels and our immunity, and very important to regulate histamine. Histidine releases the tranquil alpha waves in the brain. It also is important for both red and white blood cells, histidine. Histidine also increases within the stomach hydrochloric acid and digestive enzymes, but not just acid, hydrochloric acid, but also digestive enzymes. Histidine is very important for the lining of the synovial fluid of every single joint and between the vertebrae, our disc. Mast cell activation. Mast cells are a type of white blood cell that is found in connective tissue all through the body, underneath the skin, near blood vessels, lymph vessels, lungs, and also the intestine. They contain chemicals such as histamine, which I just shared about histidine uptakes histamine, heparin, cytokines, and also growth factors. They activate the widening of blood vessels and the development of new blood vessels. During an allergic response, they can cause flushing and itching. Cytokines are small proteins that are crucial in controlling the growth and the activity of other immune system cells and blood cells. When released, they signal the immune system to do its job. They affect the growth of the blood cells and other cells that help the body's immune and inflammation responses. Histidine, amino acid, is an important neurotransmitter involved in various psychological processes, physiological processes. It acts during inflammatory responses. Heparin acts as an anticoagulant to prevent blood clotting. Mast cells and histamine are an important part of the immune system and help fight infection. When mast cells detect a substance that triggers an allergic reaction, an allergen, they release histamine and other chemicals into the bloodstream. Histamine makes the blood vessels expand and the surrounding skin itchy or swollen. The Vital Life Energy Formulas program, as we give a program with our foot baths and our clay foot baths and our clay baths and our full Epsom salt baths and all the different treatments that we've taught for over 30 years now with the Vital Life Energy program. The Vital Life Energy program of amino acids goes into the liver, and our liver sends these enzymes, peptides, and electrolytes and proteins into the bone marrow. The amino acids are the raw material to cells when the bone marrow, liver, and colon, for the bone marrow, liver, and colon. So they activate the new cells. These cells regenerate the body and activate T cells, which of course are our intelligent immune cells. That's the T cells. The thymus cells, that's what it stands for, which, remember, the thymus is known as the diamond soul. As the Greek philosophy, look at the diamond soul, the thymus, as the will of soul. It's also where our heart is. So the immune cells, they actually are the intelligent ones, being the T cells, the thymus cells, to recognize inflammation as well as build immunity. Now, We were just talking as a group earlier before we started the recording about the updated purification that Jeff and Lynn have updated just recently. And the reason for the purification is to switch the pH in the blood to help with the mast cells. And when you do the purification, 3 days or a week, whatever works for you, starting with 3 days to switch the pH, and then, you might want to keep going depending on what you might be feeling with any sorts of cravings or hunger, which we support you as you do the purification. You don't just break the purification after you've started doing the purification. You don't just go back to eating everything once you've done the purification for however many days you decide to do it. When you go back to adding foods back in after being on the purification, you slowly add in a food every 3 to 4 days. You might be craving cheese, for example. So as you come off the purification, you add some cheese in. Then you yourself will start to see what foods you can and can't digest. If you have a histamine response or a mast cell activation, your body will let you know straight away once you purify and alkalize your blood and you add the foods back in. If all of a sudden you eat the cheese and you've got a headache, that's connected to the heparin of the mast cell activation. If all of a sudden your eyes are itchy, your throat's itchy, that's the histamine. If all of a sudden you start getting a sore throat, that's the cytokines that are being activated of the mast cells from some sort of histamine response and antigen that's causing an allergic reaction. So you start to write a list, which is what somebody was sharing about, that they learned when they did the purification, certain food that they know to this day that they can't digest. So they just do not have it. They shared that on the call before we started the recording. So you start to see, which is what one person was sharing on the call when we were sharing together before the recording started today, that they learned from adding the food group back in after purifying and alkalizing the blood that they couldn't digest a certain food, which is actually cashews. As soon as they would eat the cashews after doing the purification, they added it back into their diet, they broke out with cold sores. Hey, wow, that's the cytokines. That's the cytokines from the mast cell activation causing the inflammation and the viral activity breaking out. So heparin is the blood clotting, coagulation. You get a headache when you start to add something back in and you know, uh-oh, I don't digest white rice, for example, and all of a sudden you've got a headache. Then that's the mast cell heparin being stimulated and causing inflammation in your blood and causing the blood vessels to not widen to get the blood to flow, and it causing your blood to coagulate, and there's the headaches. Now I'm going to share a couple of photos here on the iridology and what we look for. When we're looking for mast cells, whether we're dealing with heparin as the clotting of the blood, or whether we're looking at the cytokines, which is what somebody was sharing about when they added the cashews back in and all of a sudden they broke out with a cold sore after doing the purification, or we're dealing with actually histamine. All things in mast cell activation get triggered from inflammation. It's what it says right at the bottom of the newsletter. These things get, from inflammation of some sort of antigen. That's what triggers it. It says right at the bottom. These immune cells, the T cells are where we're helping everybody with, from the amino acids stimulating the bone marrow to activate your T cells. And your T cells, your intelligent immune cells, are what recognize the inflammation, so you build immunity. So anytime there's a mast cell activation, whether we're dealing with the clotting, coagulation of the blood, whether we're dealing with the immune response in the blood or the lymph, because that's the cytokines, or whether we're actually dealing with a histamine response, which is the reddening and flushing of the immune system. When there's T cells that are maturing over that 30-day cycle in your thymus gland, and the amino acids with the activation to move from your liver into your bone marrow will stimulate your T cells over that 30-day cycle within the thymus to mature and build up antibodies. And that's what we're helping everybody with in relationship to doing the Vital Life Energy Leap program. Sometimes people might need to take an antihistamine. There was somebody just the other day who was having a lot of phlegm, a lot of congestion, and just not clearing it, and they needed to be able to clear it because they were having people come from out of town for a celebration. And so in that situation, they needed the antihistamine, which is the medication that you can get over the counter. And of course, it helped them. And they needed it because they had so much inflammation going on. So they needed to reduce the histamine response that was causing all the mucus and the congestion that they couldn't stop spitting up, so that they could recover and be able to be around everybody and feel not having to carry tons of tissues on them to deal with all the congestion that was coming up in their throat and draining in the back of their throat. So sometimes we need some of that antihistamine. It's not saying not to take it. What we're doing with the amino acid combinations, there's a lot of histidine in them. Peace and Tranquility, AB formula, Adrenal Boost formula, BC, CE, the bioflavonoids, the quercetin, rutin, and the spiridin, they're natural anti-inflammatories. So there's a lot of the formulas that have anti-inflammatory properties in your program that you're taking with the Vital Life Energy. Okay, I have a couple of different eyes up on the screen, and this is really to show you all what we're looking for. Understanding the autonomic nerve reef is a landmark in everybody's iris. And I will draw this on the screen, and I always pay attention to everybody's autonomic nerve reef because it is a landmark. And there's this distinct outline that everybody has. Some people have it quite close. Of course, this photo, we don't even see it very clearly. I can see it, but you won't see it very clearly because there's a lot of toxin covering it. So a lot of toxin covering it. So the autonomic nerve reef is a landmark in everybody's eye. So we always look at the autonomic nerve reef because in everybody outside the autonomic nerve reef is your major organs. Recapping for those of you new to the treatment, anything above the top half of the eye is the brain, anything across the middle of the eye is the center of the body, and anything lower half is lower half of the body. Across the top of, when we're dealing with sinuses, it's across the top of the autonomic nerve reef. Like I'm showing you this because this is very dark here, and then this person has quite a lot of rays, which we call sun rays. And in Bernard Jensen's book, he calls it radius solaris. And in Bernard Jensen's book, the radius solaris is connected to a toxic, slow-moving bowel. Part to understand, even if the person is going and eliminating, and the peristalsis muscle is gripping, and they're going, eliminating every day, we're not just dealing with the toxic, slow-moving bowel, we're also dealing with histamine and low-grade infection, fungal, yeast overgrowth. Now, what we're looking at is when it gets dark right across the top, because the sinus sits just outside the autonomic nerve reef on the top half of the iris. This is very dark inside and outside, where you can see this one is not as dark on the inside, but you'll see it gets very yellowy on the outside of the autonomic nerve reef. So what you're seeing is this has more, the darker the color, the more toxin and buildup, the less oxygen. See, oxygen in the blood circulating, because you can have oxygen in the blood, but it's not circulating to all the cells. That's the nitric oxide that we work with the program, as the dilator to carry those blood oxygenation cells to where they need to move. This person, because we have fuzziness too across the top, and then they have the genetic cholesterol sodium ring, electrolyte ring, you're seeing a lot of histamine, also because there's a lot of rays going to the top half of the iris. Remember, as I shared, radius solaris, or we call them sun rays, is what Dr. Bernard Jensen shares as a toxic slow-moving bowel. But we also see those folks as shocks and traumas that one has gone through earlier in their life. So those spokes are also connected to the lining being inflamed of the transverse area of the bowel, because there's a connection between the transverse colon and your brain, the transverse colon and your sinuses. The same tubes along the sinuses, the eustachian tubes, connect above and below to the same tubes down in the urethra, ureter, and also for us females, the fallopian tubes from our ovaries to our cervix to our womb. And so these tubes are connected above and below. The same pH that we see within the ascending and transverse colon, as I'm sharing, the transverse has a direct connection to the brain. That same pH and the alkaline forms of the good bacteria, the microbiome in that part of the ascending transverse colon, is essential for the pH to be balanced within the prostate, the cervix, uterus, as well as the bladder, along with the blood. When the oxygen is circulating and flowing, and we're making a lot of new red blood cells, both in our liver and our bone marrow, then fungus, mold, bad bacteria, viruses, parasites, they cannot live. That takes care of the inflammatory response that can trigger the histamine in this individual, or because we don't see the same darkness inside the autonomic nerve reef in the other photo across from the darker eye, but we see a lot of this rusty orangey brown. Looking at the iris, just like we teach how the body works in balance, as above, so below to above, inside out. Healing goes from inside out, from the head down, and we always look from the inside of the iris to the outside of the iris. So the inside on this particular person's eye doesn't show a lot of that darkness, but then there's all these rays of rusty orangey color. And then you go to the outside and it's very fuzzy, very, very fuzzy. Now remember, in the fuzziness, I know this other eye has fuzziness too, but because it's dark inside is how you know there's an imbalance straight away in their microbiome, and particularly the transverse colon, even though in iridology with Dr. Bernard Jensen's understanding, that's connected to a toxic, slow-moving bowel or leaky gut. It's actually the imbalance of the bifidus within the ascending transverse colon, and then, of course, it's a good environment for bacteria, mold and fungus to feed off in that area, and then, of course, it's entering the bloodstream. And the pH is switching there in that ascending transverse colon, and autointoxication is happening, which is part of the inflammation that this person is getting. When you go to the other photo on the right, you don't have the same darkness on the inside, but you've got all this rusty orangey color. And so then you look to the outer rim right at the top and you see it's fuzzy, even though this eye has fuzziness too. And that fuzziness in the top half of the iris is the poor blood oxygenation and circulation moving to the brain. So what does that tell us? Well, we have that rusty orangey color, which is the sugar, the sucrose. The sugar holds on to carbon dioxide. Amino acids that build the glycogen reserve for glucose holds on to oxygen. So there's more sucrose environmentally and genetically, which environmentally, when I say that, that's the diet, but also genetically for that individual on the right-hand side of the screen that I'm circling my mouse with. but also it's fuzzy at the top. So that's the blood not having enough oxygenation and not getting enough circulation that the person needs to the brain. So that's the heparin part that we just talked about with mast cells. So we have to make sure that we help that person's blood vessels with the mast cell activation and their heparin, which deals with the coagulation. You can see that too when you look to the whites of the eyes, because there's brown discoloration in the whites of the eyes. So you start to see a story of the individual, because we all have our own story. It's such a beautiful thing, our lives. It really is. It teaches us so many things. Being alive is such a gift. And you start to see your own story. It's a remarkable story that we all have individually. Love life, right? It's the loving of the life. So I want to show you the last thing, which has to do with the cytokines. Showing you 3 different irises to give you some idea of what you're looking for when you're looking for mast cell activation. This is a very different eye for all of you to see. And we've got very white, see? Very different from the other 2 photos, with one being very dark, which is why I'm sharing about the gut microbiome. And then now we've got a very white halo going around the pupil, and we don't see the autonomic nerve reef like the other 2 photos. We could see the autonomic nerve reef in the lighter color, the darker brown eye, because there's so much bad bacteria and fungus in that top of the transverse, which we couldn't see the autonomic nerve reef. This one is covered, the autonomic nerve reef, which is all that white and rusty orangey yellow. Now, because the sinus sits across the top is the only reason I'm focusing on that, because these other parts mean areas too. But looking at this, when we don't see very much the autonomic nerve reef, and then we see the whites are very red, and the red is touching the iris. So we're dealing with the mast cells and the cytokines, which, remember, regulate the immune system, both in the lymph and the blood. 50% of the lymph is within the reproductive area, which is, of course, what we're seeing with this yellowish discoloration around the pupil on the lower half of the iris, because the lower half of the iris is the lower half of the body. The top is the brain. So there's more white across the top and yellow rusty color down the bottom, which, remember, we just talked about that rusty yellowy color being sugar, sucrose. And so there's a lot more of the yellow in the lower part of this individual's iris connected to the reproductive area. There's a lesion too, right where the ovary is. So knowing that, 50% of our lymph, and remember, mast cells are underneath the lining of the skin. They're in blood vessels. They're in, close to blood vessels, close to lymphatic vessels. And of course, that's the reproductive area where the lymph vessels and the blood vessels connect, but they also connect above, underneath the arms and the subclavicles, or the clavicles, across the base of the neck there, where the connecting ducts drain the lymphatic vessels into the blood vessels. So this is showing you, because you can see the person's dealing with viral activity, as well as that halo, that we don't see the autonomic nerve reef. It's very important to see the autonomic nerve reef, is that's the vagus nerve that connects to our eyes, our ears, our throat, our heart, our lungs, our liver, pancreas, stomach, spleen, and all the way down to our sacrum. And when it's being covered, then that longest nerve of the autonomic nervous system is not regulating when we need to relax, when we need to digest, when we need to eliminate, when we need to assimilate. That's the autonomic nervous system. Of course, that's showing you the cytokine of the mast cell activation, from seeing inside out, as well as not seeing the autonomic nerve reef. So I hope this was helpful for you all today. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Those of you following our program, as we shared on the newsletter, we express our gratitude to you. We here at Vital Life want to express our sincere gratitude to each and every one of you for following the program. Thank you. We are always here for you. We wish you love and light in all your healing journey. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again all next week.